Hello and welcome to my channel. Well, here we are again doing yet another response to Brethren Lee on the subject of blood. This marks the third time he's published a video about blood transfusions since the Watchtower recently announced that Jehovah's Witnesses are free to have their own blood stored and transfused for medical procedures. Lee's stance is that the Bible prohibits putting blood into the body, in his words, in any kind of way. First, let me grant something very clearly. The Bible does prohibit eating blood. That is not in dispute. The question is not whether blood is prohibited. The question is, what kind of action does Scripture prohibit? Because that matters. When you go to Genesis 9, the prohibition concerns eating flesh with its blood still in it. In Leviticus 17, the reason given is that the life is in the blood, and therefore blood is not to be treated as ordinary food. In Acts 15, the command to abstain from blood appears in a context involving food-related practices, such as eating things sacrificed to idols or things that were strangled and from which the blood had not been drained. In every case, the category is the same: ingestion. Eating. That's the biblical category. In his latest treatise on the subject, Lee introduced what he called a cosmetic law argument, as if the only alternative to his view is that God prohibited blood merely because drinking blood looks gross or detestable. But that's a false choice. That doesn't prevent him from using it in his previous videos. Let's take a look.
So here they're saying, okay, you can store the blood and then later consume it in a transfusion. So therefore, that would mean that you can also eat that blood. You can drink that blood. Now, I would never do anything like that. But you can now say it's okay to drink and eat that blood. You can store that blood at home in a ketchup bottle, maybe. Put some on a hamburger, some fries, hot dog, and everything's okay. Because that's exactly what is being said here.
That whole argument is just plain disgusting and manipulative. The issue was never that blood looks bad. The biblical reason is explicitly theological. Blood represents life. That is not an aesthetic reason. That is not a cosmetic concern. And once you recognize that, the false dilemma falls apart, and you can see Lee's argument for exactly what it is. That also exposes why the ketchup bottle analogy fails. The suggestion that allowing medical storage or return of blood somehow opens the door to people treating blood like a condiment for burgers or fries, as he did in that video, is not a serious argument. It's just offensive. No one is advocating medical use of blood because they want to eat it. That is an invented and grotesque scenario used solely for shock value. Storing blood for a medical procedure is not the same thing as storing blood in the refrigerator for food. Equating those two things is not exegesis. It's just rhetoric. It's just hot air. And frankly, if the biblical case against transfusion were plain, horror story hypotheticals like Lee's would not be necessary. There was also the reference to the first transfusions in the 1660s, as though the existence of a later medical procedure somehow proves that Scripture must be forbidding it all along. That just doesn't follow. The fact that a practice was unknown in biblical times does not mean an ancient dietary command automatically governs it. If he's going to claim that, he needs to demonstrate it. He needs to prove it. But supporting his assertions with facts isn't something that Lee allows himself to be bothered with very often. The fact that he says something is, to him, sufficient proof of its validity, and he just expects you to accept it. No one is claiming transfusion is a loophole around the command not to eat blood. The question is whether transfusion even belongs in the category the command addresses. And just for a refresher, that category was eating, it's ingestion. Simply pointing out that transfusions appeared in 1667 doesn't answer that question at all. Now let me address Samson, because that's an example that he frequently goes to as proof of his prohibition. Someone may point to Samson and say that because his mother was forbidden grape products while he was in the womb, God was cutting off every means by which the child could receive what was prohibited. But notice why that example works. It works because the issue is still ingestion. It's still eating. What the mother consumes is metabolized and passed to the child. That's how a fetus in the womb eats. The category hasn't changed. It's still ingestion. It's still about what is taken into the body as nourishment. And that actually reinforces the point I'm making. Samson does not expand the category beyond ingestion. It merely confirms it. But a blood transfusion is not analogous to that. A transfusion is not blood passing through digestion. It is not nourishment reaching an unborn child through the placenta. It is not drinking through a needle. It is a medical procedure involving circulation, not consumption. So invoking Samson does not prove that every internal use of a substance counts as eating. In fact, it proves the opposite. It shows the biblical category remains solely ingestion. And that leads to the core issue. Lee assumes a prohibition against eating blood automatically extends to every possible use of blood. In his own words, in any kind of way. But where does Scripture say that? Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Where does the Bible define a non-ingestive use of something as eating? Spoiler alert, it's not there. That extension must be demonstrated. It can't simply be assumed. A prohibition against eating blood does not, by itself, prove a prohibition against every internal use of blood. Moving from one to the other requires an additional argument, and that is precisely the argument that has not been established in Lee's video at all. So I'll close with a simple question. Where does the Bible define a non-digestive use of blood as eating blood? Where does the Bible prohibit the use of blood in any kind of way? If that cannot be shown, then the transfusion argument rests solely on Lee's assumptions and personal opinions, not on established, provable biblical teaching. Thanks for watching.